Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. So we're really excited to kick off our Rosa Luxemburg study group series with this event tonight. And I'm really happy to welcome Helen to join us. Helen's a professor of English in Vermont and has written extensively on the life about many things, but specifically on the life and work of Rosa Luxemburg. And she recently edited and provided a long, very useful introduction to a new reprinting of Reformer Revolution and the Mass Strike. It's a 2008 Haymarket edition of the essential works of Rosa Luxemburg. And I recommend that edition for Helen's introduction alone, if folks are able to get a copy of that. And the way this is going to work is that our study group organizers came up with 3 prepared questions to kind of give Helen an opportunity to take us into the life and works of Rosa Luxemburg. And I'm going to ask the questions one at a time. And then, like Andrew said, after that, we are going to, we're going to open it up for discussion amongst the participants. And I'm Jessie. I'm a teacher in Portland, Maine, and I'm really happy to see everybody here tonight. Especially nice to see some folks from our previous study groups who we haven't seen since earlier in the summer, I think. So if we're all set, our first question that we have for Helen is, if you could just paint a picture for us of who was Rosa Luxemburg.
Yes, of course. And thank you, Jessie, and thanks everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm so glad to be among other people who are grappling with the works of this really important figure. But I do often think that Luxemburg herself would be somewhat horrified by the attention that is given to her as an individual. So, for example, in her hometown, in her adopted home in Berlin, train stations, streets, city plazas are named after her, alongside some establishment figures who she spent her life opposing. And there's always, of course, a danger of seeing history in terms of great individuals. So in answering this question, I would want to turn to the historical circumstances that shaped her, and which is the world at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th centuries. And that was a world in transition and upheaval. Europe was still dominated by the old empires, particularly the loathsome Tsarist regime, but it was also in a frenzy of capitalist expansion and concentration, as well as imperialist rivalry and colonial conquest. So it was a time of naked class exploitation, dispossession, and appropriation at home and abroad. But the period also saw the development of a mass socialist movement marked by the founding of the Second International, which was basically a global federation of socialist organizations rooted in the working class in 1889. That's when it was founded. So it was also a time of tremendous struggle and hope for liberation and change. Luxemburg was born in 1871, aptly enough, the year that the working class, for a brief time, created a socialist society in the Paris Commune. And she grew up in Russian-occupied Poland, where the peasantry suffered under the remnants of serfdom, no democratic rights, general impoverishment. And at the same time, the rapid spread of this new voracious capitalism brought fresh miseries for the industrial working class. So Polish capitalism was exploding, immense profits being made from the brutal exploitation of Polish workers who endured, 14, 15-hour workdays, lived in dire conditions, no civil or legal rights or protections to speak of. And then Poles were further subject to colonial oppression, systematically denied economic and social opportunities, their language and culture suppressed. And then on top of that, for the Jewish population, the situation was even harsher, as they faced further discrimination and persecution and were excluded from many occupations and denied basic equality. So Rosa's family was part of a small Jewish middle class made up of merchants and intellectuals, She received a modern education. She grew up in a culturally and intellectually very rich environment. And despite periods of hardship, mostly lived in material security. But she certainly witnessed the conditions of the working class majority, and she experienced firsthand the combined oppressions of being Polish and Jewish, and additionally of being female in a patriarchal society. And then on top of that, due to a mistreated hip complaint in childhood, she had a physical impairment that led to lifelong disability. And often in the vicious attacks that get leveled at her in her day, you can see either overt or thinly veiled or really just blatant misogyny, as well as anti-Semitism and ableism. So all of these factors, no doubt, contributed to her early and lasting opposition to the system and all forms of oppression and suffering. But it was the mass socialist movement that gave her life particular meaning. So the young Rosa became active in the resistance movement in the schools, where students were rebelling against quotas, against restrictions, and against discrimination against Polish and Jewish students. And from there, she became involved in the illegal socialist movement, joining Marxist reading groups in the factories and other forms of organizing. But then the police discovered her activities, and facing arrest or possibly deportation to Siberia, she was forced to leave Poland in 1889 and go into exile. So the next phase of her life was in Zurich, which was a major destination for Polish and Russian exiles at the time. And she attended the university, which was informally known as the alma mater of young revolutionaries, because it was a hotbed of socialist activity. And while she was a brilliant student and ended up getting a PhD, she dedicated herself to organizing in the working class movement and collaborating with some of the leading Marxists of the day. She couldn't be farther from the academic Marxist. Throughout her life, she insisted that theory must be tested and checked by practice. And she constantly learned, and her theory was informed by her experience on the streets and in workplaces. So during this period, she also established what would become lifelong leadership with the Polish Socialist Party that she helped found. And she also established herself in the Socialist International. But in 1898, she moved to Berlin, where the socialist movement was the largest and the strongest, and where she believed she could make the most difference. And that's where she spent the rest of her life. And Germany really sharply embodied all of the larger contradictions of rapid industrialization and capitalist modernization, coexisting with old traditions and power relations. And it had a mass, politically conscious and combative working class movement with socialism at its core. So Luxemburg joined Germany's Party of Social Democracy, known as the SPD, and became one of its most important revolutionary leaders. At this time, by the way, social democracy, socialism, communism were used interchangeably, and the International was often referred to as the social democracy. And all of this included both committed Marxists and also reformists, which we'll get to later. So Luxemburg remained committed to collective struggle. She was always in the mass movement, participated in strikes, campaigns, revolutions, alongside thousands of other men and women fighting for a better world. Her first assignment when she was still in her 20s was to travel to Upper Silesia to agitate among miners and metal workers, and she won deep respect for that work. And her final days were spent on the streets trying to defend and ensure victory for the German Revolution. So in between, in a mere 2 decades, she achieved the work of several lifetimes. She made a serious contribution to economic theory with her book, The Accumulation of Capital. She was a leading opponent of imperialism and war. She wrote one of the great anti-war pamphlets of all time. And she spent many years in prison for her activism. She taught Marxist theory at the party school, which provided a socialist alternative education for workers. She participated in the Russian Revolution of 1905. She literally wrote the book on the mass strike, and she developed an analysis of the role of trade unions that remains really insightful and helpful. She toured the country, giving speeches to mass audiences. She won leadership in 3 different socialist parties and the Socialist International, and founded the German Communist Party. So a short life, but I think we would agree, well-lived. I'll take a pause there.
Thank you so much, Helen. That gives us a really good picture. So the next question is if you could touch on some of her key theoretical contributions of Reform or Revolution and speak to the historical backdrop in which she was making those arguments.
Right. So the SPD, the party that she just joined, had been founded in 1875 on what was called the Erfurt program. And this was a dual commitment to what was called the minimum program, which was immediate reforms that could ameliorate conditions while also building the political confidence of the oppressed, and the maximum program, overthrowing the system and building a socialist society on completely new foundations. The party grew rapidly under conditions of illegality in its early years, so underground, secret, avoiding the police. And then the German anti-socialist laws were repealed in 1890, and the SPD became an official political force with representatives in the central government, as well as many local legislatures. And over the coming decades, it grew into what was famously called a state within a state. I'm just going to read this description by her biographer, Mary Alice Waters, because it's just gives such a rich picture of what the party became. So in 1912, the SPD won 4.25 million votes, or 34.7% of the total, making it the largest party in the Reichstag with 110 deputies. By the beginning of 1914, SPD membership had passed the 1 million mark. The party published 90 daily papers, which reached 1.4 million subscribers. It also had a large women's movement, a youth section, cooperatives, sports and cultural organizations, and several million workers in social democratic-led trade unions. The capital assets of the SPD's various branches and activities were worth 21.5 million marks, and some 3,500 people were employed in the party, trade union and related apparatuses, end quote. So it was a big deal. And such a thing was not even imaginable for other countries like Poland or Russia, where if you openly advocated for socialism, you were arrested or deported. In those cases, the socialist movement still had to be underground. And the work Luxemburg did in Poland was under conditions of illegality. And as for the Russian Bolsheviks, lacked access to all of the trappings of bourgeois democracy that the SPD had. So the German party was a tremendous achievement, but with these successes came some problems. So when Luxemburg arrived in Berlin in 1898, the SPD already had a mass membership and influence, and most people in Second International assumed that it represented the model that other groups would follow. But many also realized that the new revisionism was a dangerous development that violated the principles of Marxism at the heart of the Erfurt program. So what was going on was that a layer of permanent paid bureaucrats within the party were becoming very comfortable with the status quo, were out of touch with the actual conditions of workers, peasants, and the poor, and had accommodated themselves to the system, which they increasingly benefited from with handsome salaries and cushy jobs, much like the elite presidents of major national unions in the US today. Highly waged, highly salaried individuals cut off from most people. So Luxemburg, who'd already often challenged the party's routines and deeply ingrained habits, argued that socialists could not afford to leave this new current, this reformism, unchallenged. So it was left to the consummate outsider. She was young, she was Polish, she was Jewish, she was female, she was small of stature, she had a disability, to take on this fight. So she took on the establishment of this massive institution. Now, the spokesperson for the other side, one of the main ones, was Edward Bernstein. Middle-class German living in London, Bernstein had certainly become detached from conditions for Germany's workers. And he was influenced by British members of parliament and Fabians, who, a brand of socialists who argued that you basically could get socialism through persuading people to be nicer. He published a series of articles for Neue Zeit, the SPD's main theoretical journal, and then a book, which was published in English as Evolutionary Socialism. And I'm just going to summarize his arguments and then go through Luxemburg's response. So Bernstein argued that while revolution may have been necessary in the past, capitalism had been tamed to such an extent that it was no longer necessary. Therefore, he proclaimed, quote, "That which is generally called the ultimate aim of socialism is nothing, but the movement is everything." So the scientific basis for socialism, the inherent contradictions within capitalism that had been identified by Marx and the Socialist International, was now obsolete due to certain changed features. And they were, one, the end of crises. And indeed, at this time, there had been no major crises since 1873, although when Marx and Engels developed the theory, there were major crises occurring every decade. Secondly, the development of cartels, basically the concentration of small companies into larger and larger monopolies. And thirdly, the expansion of credit, the greater availability of money for new production. So because of all these developments, he argued, socialism could come gradually through other new developments hastened by the SPD in parliament. And they are the spread of democracy, the increase of wealth throughout society, the growth and influence of trade unions, the spread of worker-owned cooperatives, which would replace the profit system with shared ownership. In his vision, society would gradually exert more control over the ruling class and empower workers until capitalists just became neutral administrators. He argued that the situation for workers was no longer hopeless, but instead improving and capable of further improvement to the extent that a workers' revolution to overthrow capitalism would no longer be necessary. And he argued that while violent revolution may be a quicker way to get to socialism, constitutional legislation is a stronger, more lasting, and more rational course. So that's the basic case for the reformists. Luxemburg responded in articles in 1898 and 1899, which were then published as a single pamphlet in 1908, which is what I'm referring to, Reform or Revolution. And the work is really a study in the historical material method. Luxemburg begins by pointing out that Bernstein's a vulgar economist. He's taking the impressionistic perspective of the individual capitalist and pulling details out of their larger context. She writes, Bernstein's theory does not seize these manifestations of contemporary economic life as they appear in their organic relationship with the whole of capitalist development, with the complete economic mechanism of capitalism. His theory pulls these details out of their living economic context. It treats them as the disjecta membra, or separate parts of a lifeless machine. So Luxemburg explains that historical materialism, on the other hand, starts from the larger perspective and analysis of the whole capitalist system and understands each individual event or facet in its relation to the concrete social totality. What's more, historical materialism rejects the perspective of the individual capitalist and takes that of the oppressed majority, the only class with the interest and the power to end the horrors of capitalism and bring into being a new society. Bernstein, by removing the scientific basis of Marxism, had taken a step backward. He was going back to the pre-Marxist notion of socialism as an abstract utopia with no means of getting there. Luxemburg also rejects altogether the opposition between reform or revolution. In that sense, the title is misleading. She argues that socialists cannot choose one or the other. She writes, "The daily means of engaging and working for reforms, for the amelioration of the conditions of workers within the framework of the existing social order and for democratic institutions, offers to the social democracy the only means of engaging in the proletarian class war and working in the direction of the final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labor. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for the social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its aim." So in the course of her argument, she shows that Bernstein, far from offering an alternative means to the same end, worker emancipation, socialism, has in fact thrown out this aim altogether. She continues, "Those who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal." So she reiterates that the aim of revolutionary struggle is the working class majority taking power and putting an end to the exploitation and oppression that is baked into capitalism. In skipping revolutionary struggle, reformism is not only utopian, but also a threat to the working class movement itself. Bernstein, in fact, had mixed up reform and revolution. He'd got them backwards. Far from reforms being a substitute for the future revolution, they're actually the product of the last revolution because, Luxemburg explains, revolution is the act of political creation in the history of classes. I just love that bit. It's just such a brilliant section. The existing legal constitution under capitalism was made possible by bourgeois revolution, which replaced feudal absolutism with capitalism. The possibilities of reform, therefore, are now limited by the economic and social relations of capitalism. There's only so far you can go. And far from themselves being the ends, reforms are primarily important as the means to the greater end. So socialists ask questions of reforms. How much do they forward class struggle? How much do they successfully train the working class to strengthen their task of overthrowing the ruling class? How do they prepare us for replacing capitalism, a system based on human exploitation and the subordination of human need to capitalist profit, with socialism, a society that offers the liberation of all humanity? Reformism, Luxemburg writes, is nothing more than the attempt to replace revolution with an endless series of reforms, and it's a doomed attempt. So, but Luxemburg doesn't only assert these arguments, she really takes on Bernstein's case point by point. She takes up his claim that Marx's analysis of the fundamental contradictions within the system, particularly the labor theory of value, is outdated. She writes, this is a brilliant bit too, and it shows her constant use of metaphor. Bernstein forgets that Marx's abstraction is not an invention, it is a discovery. It does not exist in Marx's head, but in market economy. It has not an imaginary existence, but a real social existence, so real that it can be cut, hammered, weighed, and put in the form of money. The abstract human labor discovered by Marx is, in its developed form, no other than money. So capitalism, she explains, has a central contradiction in the tendency of production to expand while the consumption capacity of the market is limited. Capitalist profits come from the exploitation of workers. That's the basis of capitalism. So the fundamental and Unavoidable antagonism is between the ruling class, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the workers or the proletariat. These contradictions and antagonisms are inherent to the system. Cartels and credit can't get around them, but instead make them worse. As she puts it, cartels are part of a phase of capitalist development which aggravates the anarchy of the capitalist world and expresses and ripens its internal contradictions, end quote. Cartels just increase the antagonism between producers and consumers and between capitals and workers by opposing in the most brutal fashion to the working class the superior force of organized capital. And then further, they take capitalist competition to the world stage, which leads to battles between different nation states and therefore to imperialism and war. Credit too, she explains, by further separating production from demand, only increases the tendency to overproduction and the overall instability of the economy. And then as for Bernstein's trump card, which was the lack of major economic crises in the previous 3 decades, Luxemburg writes in 1908, hardly had Bernstein rejected in 1898 Marx's theory of crises when a profound general crisis broke out in 1900, while 7 years later, a new crisis beginning in the United States hit the world market. Facts proved the theory of adaptation to be false. She also swiftly and brilliantly demolishes the notions that democracy and freedoms inevitably expand with capitalist development, that trade unions can of themselves go beyond defending workers, and that co-ops can escape the contradictions of the system, which are all things we could maybe talk about more in the discussion. Bernstein argued that by renouncing revolution and following a legal course of social reform, we can choose a non-violent path. Luxemburg answers that this reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the character of the state, which does not represent an abstract society, but rather the ruling class. Bernstein believed that socialists can get elected and legislate socialism, but Luxemburg points out that when socialism stops being the opposition and becomes the ruling party, it, quote, is allowed to rise only on the ruins of the bourgeois state. Therefore, another quote, if social democracy were to accept the opportunist standpoint, renounce the use of violence, and pledge the working class never to diverge from the path of bourgeois legalism, then its whole parliamentary and other activity would sooner or later collapse miserably and leave the field to the untrammeled dominance of reactionary violence, end quote. Instead, socialists, she concludes, must always retain their political independence and build organization among the largest numbers possible in order to mobilize our greatest strengths, our size, and our ability to withhold our labor. I'll take another pause there.
Thanks so much, Helen. There's so much in that very relatively short book, Reform or Revolution. There's just so much that, in my opinion, is fundamental to a lot of our theories as socialists. I have one last question before we have discussion amongst participants. And the question is, what are the enduring lessons and relevance of this text for socialists today, and how does it relate to our political situation today?
I mean, for me, I think most importantly, it makes the case for socialism from below. And this is relevant because we're currently seeing a resurgence of socialism, which is wonderful. But we're also seeing a return of 2 versions of socialism from above. On the one hand, Stalinism, the model of powerful states and dictatorships ruling on the behalf of the people, and reformism, sometimes now confusingly called democratic socialism or parliamentary socialism, which is this idea that you can get social transformation just through elections. And both are antithetical to everything that Luxemburg stood for. And she gives us the arguments and the ammunition for why. Briefly on the first model, on Stalinism, of course, Luxemburg didn't live to see the reversal of the revolutionary wave that swept the world after 1917. She didn't see the development of the Soviet Empire. But during her lifetime, she was consistently opposed to supporting any national ruling class, even if they seemed a lesser evil compared to Russian Tsarism or the Prussian Empire. That's point one. And then secondly, during his regime, Stalin himself, not surprisingly, denounced Luxemburg, and the Soviet Union took great pains to bury her record. That's why so much of her works weren't available for so long. This indicates how far she was from that model. And of course, Reform or Revolution offers a devastating critique of electoralism. Her warnings about the dangers of reformism were proven correct in the most extreme form in the last years of her life. So I'm just going to go back there for a moment before coming back to the present. In 1914, the SPD reformists led the party into supporting Germany in World War I, lining up with the ruling class, championing imperialism and nationalism, and betraying the international working class. And this led to the breakup of the Second International. And then when Germany was on the brink of revolution in 1918, the capitalists turned to social democracy, now in power, to save their system, reaching an agreement with leaders of the SPD and the trade union bureaucrats who joined with them. They joined with the capitalists against the masses struggling for social transformation. So the reformists, the very ones who claimed to shun violence in favor of a peaceful path, sent paramilitaries, precursors of the fascists, to crush worker uprisings and soldier rebellions. And in January 1919, they brutally murdered Luxemburg and her comrades who'd formed the revolutionary opposition. And this was a turning point that marked the end of an epoch for the working class movement and the reversal of the revolutionary tide. This was not the inevitable outcome. And the SPD played a decisive role in the counter-revolution. So that's a really important and sober lesson for us. And in various forms and to various degrees, this has been repeated over the intervening century. When socialists, or indeed any kind of reformists, have come to power, their task has been to run the system. Real power is actually deeply embedded in capitalism, in the non-elected bodies that own and control, from the capitalists and corporations to the judicial system and the military establishment. And they won't allow even the most committed of socialists to legislate their power away. When socialists actually threaten to change the system, capitalism either removes them in violent coups, as in Allende in Chile, or pressures them to impose austerity on workers, as in Syriza in Greece. And what this suggests is that there aren't any shortcuts. Socialism can only come from the mass collective struggles of working class and oppressed people. It can't be imposed from above. It can't be decreed from above. So there are many lessons to be drawn for the current situation in the US. Obviously, the Democratic Party presents itself as the reform option, though of course they're a capitalist party and they're not socialist in any guise, even when right-wing lunatics try and paint them as such. And they also present themselves, and often are, the lesser evil compared to the Republicans. But one negative impact of that is that progressives and leftists are less likely to protest Democrats. But Luxemburg's warning is that no matter who is in power, whether they present themselves as a defender of white supremacy or as a friend to Labour, activists must continue to organize independently to oppose injustices and defend our rights. And there are more examples than I could possibly explore here, but I'll just mention one for the present, because last night I was I had the great pleasure of hearing a webinar by Harsha Walia, and she spent some time describing the role of the Democratic Party in building ICE and hastening deportations, detentions, and criminalization of migrants. This has been a completely bipartisan project. When Trump was in power, there was a vibrant immigrant rights movement, but the Biden effect has muffled organizing around this as well as other issues. So even when racist border guards are caught on video beating Haitians, there is less protest than if the same thing happened under Trump. So I think that, it's kind of, we can look to Luxembourg to help us explain and push against those forces. But reform or revolution doesn't only give us these negative examples, it also gives a sense of the immense power that lies in mass movements of ordinary people, regardless of who is in power. And again, you have to go back to what shaped her. Luxembourg embodied and captured for posterity a moment that came closer to world revolution than any other time in history. She never lost her faith in working class struggle. She continued to lead revolutionary parties in Poland and Germany, even though she was persecuted and imprisoned many times. She participated in the Russian Revolution of 1905. She followed and analyzed the Russian Revolution of 1917 from her prison cell, and she played a leading role in the German Revolution until she was murdered in January 1919. So in the process of this life, she saw firsthand the creative power of mass strikes and movements, and she left us a powerful and tangible record of what revolutionary transformation looks like. The first time I read Luxembourg, it seemed like mass strikes were a thing of the past. But in one of the bright lights of an otherwise very grim period that we're living through, the last few years has actually seen the return of the mass strike globally in ways very reminiscent of Luxembourg's mass strike. And the 500,000 South Korean workers currently preparing for a general strike right now is just one of a string of examples. And I think one of the other things that I think is really important that Luxembourg leaves us is the importance of organization, because contrary to an enduring myth about her, she didn't believe that socialist revolution was inevitable, nor that it would happen spontaneously. Rather, she recognized that our side has to be organized in practice and informed in theory if we're to defend ourselves and build alternatives. And we have to build on the struggles of the past as well as the present. And this is also, been proven in practice time after time over the past century. Mass movements, revolutionary situations have emerged and led to stunning change. In fact, everything that is valuable, both globally and locally, that we can call a right today was achieved by courageous working class people taking collective action, from the weekend to anti-discrimination policies. And to take just two examples of achievements that I certainly didn't expect to see in my lifetime when I was young: the end of apartheid in South Africa, the right of same-sex marriage in the USA. Seemed impossible. But at the same time, as Luxembourg recognized, these victories are limited and partial as long as the capitalist system remains intact. They've got to be extended and fiercely protected, or we lose them, as we've seen with the dismantling of the gains of the civil rights movement, or the threat currently to abortion rights. Again, many more examples. And I think this brings us back to the starting point for Luxembourg. Reform and revolution are closely interconnected. It matters that we fight for reforms, whether large or small, from wage increases to healthcare, to bus routes, to disarming the police. But in order to be effective in those struggles, we also need the vision, the greater vision of social transformation. And I think I'll pause here and just end with a quote, which I'm editing volume 5 of the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, which I'll just plug for a moment, by Verso. It's a very important project that's making available Luxemburg's works, many of them in English for the first time ever. And this just was something, it comes from What Does the Spartacus League Want?, which she wrote in 1918. It was one of the last things she wrote. Just one sentence. Socialism is not a question of parliamentary elections, but a question of power. That was a long time to hear my own voice, so I'll be pleased to pause now.
Thanks so much, Helen. I'm sure that there are people who joined us tonight who have read Reform or Revolution and got maybe a deeper understanding of some of the background and some of the theory. And I'm sure there are people here too for whom this is their first kind of introduction to it. And I think that this was probably the best introduction you could get to Reform or Revolution. And one quick thing about Rosa Luxemburg that I think is amazing, and I think that Helen really drew out, was that she wasn't committed. She wasn't just a committed activist who also had some strengths in theory, nor was she a theoretician who also occasionally popped out onto a picket line. She was truly somebody who could integrate theory and practice in a way that I can't think of too many other people who have. And I think that it's really her contributions are just invaluable to the socialist movement today. And with that, Andrew, do you want to talk about how the discussions